Welcome back everyone. My name is Sagar and in this video we will be learning about exception handling in Java. So first of all, what is an exception? So exception means that there is some problem that is unexpected. So unexpected problem. So if you are a science student, then you might already know this thing. And suppose for an example, exception can be, suppose for an example, you ordered something from Amazon and they have their delivery on the way. But suppose in the way their delivery man is not available, so they will consider it as an exception and they have to handle that thing because they have to deliver something to you and that should not stop. So this is the same thing in our programming. When any unexpected problem occurs, then we have to handle that thing. Exception handling. So this is the same thing in programming. But how can we do this thing? So we have some keywords for this. First of all, we have try block. So this is a block of code that we have to use to just write our code that might throw an exception. And after that, we have our catch block. And there is a catch block. That means inside this, we have to catch our exception. If any exception occurred in our try block, so we have to use these two things together. And after that we have one throw keyword, and after that throws keyword, and before that we are going to learn about finally keyword. So there are these five things that we are going to learn. So first of all, let me just tell you about some exception in Java. So what is an exception? Suppose we are creating an array. I think you already know about arrays. So array, and this is a size of 2. So suppose the size of this array is 2 and we are accessing something. So int a equal to array's fifth element, and you can see there is a problem. This is a huge problem and it is one of the most common problem, and if I am trying to run this thing, then this will just throw me an exception and you will just see some red lines. So you can see we are creating an array of size 2, but we are accessing the fifth element of the 2 sized array. So this is not possible, and you can see exception is thread main. So this is the exception name, that is java.lang.array index out of bound exception, and you can see this thing. And after that we have this message index 5 out of bound for length 2. And what if now we have to catch that exception? And let me say if I am also printing this thing, printing, and after that this a. So now we are not going to print this thing because when any exception occurs, so in this line there is exception that is happening, and after that we are going to stop our code and we are not going to print anything after this. Suppose I also have some important things. So important things here that I should implement, I should run, but here in this line number 14, there is an exception, so we are not going to print anything after this. And you can see there is nothing that we are printing and we are just throwing an exception. So how can we catch this thing? So first of all, we have to use a try block, and that means we have to try that this thing can throw an exception, but we don't know about that. So suppose try block, and inside this I am taking a index user input sc dot next int, and I'm going to create a scanner object. So suppose I am getting this index from my user input and I am doing this thing, arrays index element. So this thing can be an exception and this can be not, but we are just creating an array of size 2, and if the index value is more than 1, and that means we are just going to throw an exception because the index available is 0 and 1 only. Okay, so let me just print this thing here. Okay, I will copy it from here, and that's it. So now let's just check what happens. Okay, this is a try block, and corresponding to this try block we have to also use a catch block. And what happens when there is an exception inside of this try block? Then we have to catch it. So catch, and you can see there are these parentheses now, and that means we are going to get a parameter inside of this parenthesis, and that will be an exception object, exception e. So this is the parent class of all the objects and all the exception objects, and you can see we are getting a java.lang.array index out of bound exception. So this is a particular type of exception and we are getting here all the types. So you can also define here array index out of bound exception, and we are gonna do exception occurred, sorry. So let me check it here. So we have to pass here some argument, and now you can see So first of all, we are doing this thing, printing 0, and that is because the element on the one index is 0 in this array. All right, and after that there is some important things that we are printing, and let me just run it again, and this time I'm going to pass an invalid index. So suppose I am passing an index 5, and now you can see this time exception doesn't occur and our code doesn't stop. And our code is not stopped, and you can see exception occurred, sorry, and there is something that you can do to handle that exception. Suppose for an example, if you are getting this a here, if you are defining it here, and if this thing is possible, then you are getting this array's index element, and suppose I am also passing some elements here, arrays 0 index 100. So suppose I am doing this thing, and after that I also have to print a here, and a is not initialized. So what I can do is I can also pass the value as 0 by default, or you can also pass it here when you are declaring it. So you can see this thing. So we are also printing a, and after that our code is not stopping, and we are also printing, we are also doing our important thing that we have to do after this calculation. Okay, so there is no problem now, and now you can see we just handled this exception, and after that there is one more exception. Suppose we are also doing some calculation, int a equal to, not a, x equal to suppose 1, and y will be this index value. So what we are doing is we are making a z value that will be equal to x by index. So if the value of this index is equal to 0, then what happens? So x by 0, then this will be also an exception. 1 by 0 is an exception because we cannot divide anything with 0, and in our code this will just not execute. So after that, let me try to print this z. So if the value of this index is 0, then we are also going to throw an exception, and that time it will be not a array index out of bound exception. And let me just check now. So we also have to handle that exception now. So if we are passing here 0, then now you can see there is another exception, that is their arithmetic exception. Divide by 0 is not possible. So what we can do is instead of writing here some particular exception that is their array index out of bound exception, we can just write here parent class of this exception, or what you can do is you can also write here another catch block. So you can also do this thing. So this is for our array index out of bound exception, and this is for our arithmetic exception e. And after that, suppose I am also getting this message that we are getting here. So this is our message divided by 0, and we are also going to print this, but this will be not an exception. We are just printing a message, get a message. So this is our message that we are going to print here, and now let me just remove this thing. So this is the message that we are going to print, and after that we are also going to execute this important thing. And let me just check now. So we are going to do this thing. If our division by 0 occurs and if our index out of bound occurs, then we are going to enter in this block. So 0 and printing 100 divided by 0 exception. So we also have to write here something that this is an exception. Okay, so now we also can generalize this thing. So instead of writing here another catch block, we can write here exception, and this thing will just tell us any exception occurred. And after that we also have this. So we know about try block, we know about catch block, we have this finally. So finally is a keyword that we can use to create a block, and this block will definitely run all the codes if any exception occurred. So s out any exception finally occurred. So suppose we are passing 0, then this will just create an exception, and we are going to enter in this block, and we are going to say exception occurred, because 1 by 0 is not possible. So you can see any exception finally occurred, and after that important things are also executed. So suppose I am running it again and I am passing 1. So 1 will not throw an exception, and that is because index is also possible and 1 by 1 is also possible. So this time we are going to say any exception finally occurred. Okay, we can use this finally block to write anything that we have to use to wrap up all the things. Like if we are doing some calculation here, if we are opening our database, then we can close it in this finally block, because this will always occur. this finally block will always execute if there is an exception, if we are catching that exception, and if we are not catching it. So suppose I am only catching here array index out of bound exception, and there is also finally block. So I am only catching here array index out of bound exception, but what if there is an arithmetic exception, then still we are going to print this finally block. So we are not catching that exception, but we are going to still print it. So 0, 1 by 0 will be not defined, and you can see this thing printing 100, and that is because of this line. So we are printing 100, and after that there is the exception that is occurring. So it is in line 26, and after that we are not going to print this important things, but we are going to print this finally things. So now you can see any exception finally occurred. So this is the basic difference between writing code outside of finally block and inside of finally block. That if we are catching all the exceptions, then we are going to execute this. But if there is an exception that is not caught, then this finally block will definitely execute, and we are going to print this before throwing an exception. So I hope now you understand this finally block also. And after that we have this throw and throws. So suppose for an example, if we have to throw some exception, so let me just write here, if index value is equal to 1, and let me just remove this thing now. So if index value is equal to 1, then 1 by 1 will be also equal to 1, but this time now I have to throw an exception. Throw, what is the exception? So either you can create a class that will extend the exception, or what you can do is you can just use here arithmetic exception, and you can write here your own message. So input cannot be 1, and that's it. So here this is a class, and we have to create an object of that class that we are going to get inside of this catch parameter. So we have to create a new object, and yeah, so if the index value is equal to 1, then we are going to get this arithmetic exception. So let me check all the exceptions, and I'm going to print here message e dot get message, and I am going to print this time input cannot be 1. Okay, so if the input is 1, and I'm going to enter in this block, and I'm going to throw a new exception. So this throw keyword is used to throw a new exception that we can define anywhere. So now you can see input cannot be 1, and this is our exception message. So we are not going to execute this line, and after this, first of all, we are going to catch, and after that we are going to print finally, and we just successfully caught our exception. So we are also going to print this thing after this. Okay, and I hope now you understand this thing. If we are catching our exception, then we are going to execute the code after this, and if we are not catching our exception, then first of all we are going to enter in this finally block, and after that we are going to throw some deadlines. Okay, so this is our throw keyword, and after that we have these throws. So what is the use of throws? So this can be used to tell whether a function can throw an exception or not, whether a function or class. So suppose I am using here function, and this can throw an exception. So let me create that function. So suppose there is a static void function that can throw an exception, throws arithmetic exception, using this. So we can tell whether this function can throw an exception, and if it is throwing, so throw arithmetic exception, new arithmetic exception. So it is throwing a new arithmetic exception, and after that inside this, now we know that this function can throw an exception, and we are going to get this thing here. So we are not going to print anything because we are not passing here. So this is the use of throws, that we can check that we can say, okay, our function can throw an exception, so we have to catch that thing inside of our parent class function. Okay, so we are catching it here, and if we are not catching it, then you can see we are gonna get an exception here if we are throwing it here. So we are gonna obviously get, because we are not catching this exception. Okay, and after that we know about throws keyword, and we know about throw, and that is it for today, everyone. I hope you like this video, so subscribe to our channel, and thank you for watching.